Good day. We are now in the 5th day since the start of the fighting in the Middle East, and though missile and rocket exchanges continue, for the moment at least, there has been no incursion by the Israeli forces into Gaza. And there's been growing suggestions on the part of many commentators. Simplicius the thinker has written a long piece about this, that the Israelis are having second thoughts, or he says cold feet about it, that they've looked at the situation in Gaza. They are starting to understand what a tremendously complicated and difficult operation, an armed incursion into Gaza to drive out the Hamas fighters there would be, and they've taken pause and they're thinking about what to do. There's also various reports, which I'm not going to spend too much time discussing or analysing, but there's been lots of reports that the call-up of reservists by the Israeli military has not been going especially smoothly. There have been the usual problems, inadequate uniforms, supplies of uniforms, inadequate supplies of weapons, food supplies, that kind of thing. It is some time since Israel had to call up reservists on a mass scale, and perhaps the Israeli military system, the mobilization system, which in the past worked with incredible efficiency, has now slowed down and isn't as effective and as efficient as it once was. But as we've seen with other mobilizations that have taken place recently in Russia, in Ukraine, mobilizing lots of men, tens of thousands of men, is never a straightforward enterprise if it's not constantly rehearsed, and if the arms and ammunition system supplies and the other supplies aren't constantly monitored and kept up to the appropriate level, it's inevitable that things will go wrong. Anyway, whatever the reasons, whatever the explanations, so far there has not been an Israeli incursion into Gaza. Now, I'm going to suggest that there might be one particular factor which is holding Israel back more even than the issue of casualties. And this could be concerns about the problems such an incursion might cause, which are coming from the United States. And CNN has today published a report which says that for the moment, the Israelis are asking for weapons from the United States, that the United States is able to supply. The previous transfers of weapons to Ukraine are not affecting this, because the weapon systems that the Israelis are seeking for their Iron Dome system and other such things are different from the kind of equipment that has been sent to Ukraine. But if there is an Israeli offensive against Gaza, if the Israeli army does indeed enter Gaza in an effort to try to suppress the Hamas fighters there, then, of course, that will start to burn up ammunition at a massive rate. And with US ammunition supplies now critically depleted, and with Ukraine still needing large supplies of ammunition from the United States, there simply will not be enough ammunition to go round. the United States cannot supply Ukraine and Israel with ammunition to meet to the full extent their respective needs if an incursion into Gaza begins. Now, this is an extraordinary situation. It is unique in my experience in modern American history. I've never come across a previous time when the United States was unable to match its needs with resources, but we have now arrived at that point. And we can see that the comments, the observations made for months by myself, by Brian Beletic, by Alex Vashinin, by any number of others, that the United States has been taking incredible risks by pouring shells, pouring equipment into Ukraine, but shells most of all, ammunition most of all, depleting its own stockpile of shells to critical levels, that those risks were real and they're now coming home. If it is indeed the case that the Israelis are being held back by warnings from the United States that if Israel advances into Gaza and tries to lay siege to Gaza and starts using huge amounts of ammunition to try to defeat the Hamas fighters in Gaza, then the United States will not be able to maintain the requisite levels of supplies. If that is what is happening and what is holding the Israelis back, and it seems to me that is possible, there may be all kinds of discussions going on behind the scenes between the Israelis and the Americans, and it could very well be that the Americans are now giving these warnings, then it seems to me that the Israelis will be furious, and sooner or later this will feed through to the United States and at some point is going to become public. And that, I suspect, is going to affect the whole public discussion about continued support for Ukraine in the United States. President Zelensky of Ukraine is apparently now angling for an invitation to visit Israel. He wants to go to Israel so as to project an image of Ukraine and Israel standing shoulder to shoulder in the face of aggression. He is apparently having to moderate some of his claims and those claims made by his government that the Russians were in some way involved in this affair in the Middle East. I suspect that the US and perhaps Israel have not been happy with those kind of comments. But if it is indeed the case that President Zelensky does indeed want to go to Israel, and he does indeed want to speak in Israel and address the Israeli people and stand shoulder to shoulder with them in that way, then one can see that perhaps it could be because he is nervous about the reaction both in Israel and ultimately in the United States as well, if it turns out that Ukraine has burnt up the stockpile of ammunition previously held by the United States, some of it in Israel as well, and that this is now constraining Israel's actions. So perhaps we are seeing the first major geopolitical consequence of the Biden administration's unrestrained support for Ukraine over the last 2 years. And if I'm right about this, and of course there's some element, not much, as I said, there has been that CNN article, but if I'm right about this, then as I said, that would explain Zelensky's own nervousness and his anxiety to be seen in the United States, especially as being friends with Israel, so that some of the blame for any ammunition shortage will not be fastened on him. Now, I would say that for the moment, the Israelis do not seem to be especially keen on extending an invitation to President Zelensky, and I wonder whether it isn't perhaps because they're becoming increasingly frustrated and angry and are communicating that fact to the United States. Now, I say all of this because people have suggested, Simplicius the thinker has suggested, that the Israelis are having cold feet about an advance into Gaza. But I have to say that so far, rhetoric from Israel doesn't suggest this. On the contrary, the Israelis continue to talk about the need to eradicate Hamas there. And as far as I can see, there's been no moderation in Israeli rhetoric at all. And I don't get the sense so much of cold feet as of logistical problems holding things back. And as I said, it could be connected in some respects to this call-up of reservists, but it could be also because of this issue of ammunition, which has now, as I said, finally and fully come home. One person is rushing to Israel to discuss the situation with the Israeli authorities, and that is Secretary of State Blinken. Now, one shouldn't perhaps read too much into that. In a crisis like this, a US Secretary of State is all but guaranteed to go to Israel. But if it is indeed the case that what is holding the Israelis back is ammunition shortages, then there will be, I suspect, some rather tense words exchanged, and I would be quite interested in being a fly in the wall overhearing some of these discussions. Now, there's other reports, incidentally, that it isn't just ammunition, shells, which are in short supply. There's also reports that there is a general shortage of precision-guided bombs. I find that difficult to believe, actually. The United States has a colossal stockpile, to my knowledge, of precision-guided bombs. But anyway, those reports are out there. And it's also said that the expenditure of missiles by the Iron Dome system to shoot down Hamas and Hezbollah rockets has actually started to deplete the arsenal of the Iron Dome. Now, if that's right, then all I would say is that the Iron Dome would, in that case, be a somewhat less effective system than has been suggested up to this point. If just a few days of fighting can deplete it to this extent, then it seems to me that it's probably not the great safeguard for Israel that we've all been led to think. Now, again, Simplicius the thinker has a long piece about this. He's drawn on videos from various people suggesting that the Iron Dome is not just less effective than we were all led to believe, but entirely ineffective. I'm not going to comment on that. I don't have that kind of knowledge. He says that there's a dearth of film of Iron Dome missiles intercepting and shooting down Hamas rockets. That might be the case. I'm not going to, as I said, go down there. But if it's been depleted as quickly as it apparently has been, then that is indeed a serious matter. And it has exposed a weakness in the system and has called the system, the entire efficacy of the system into question. So anyway, that's an interesting development, but an awful lot more can be said. Now, we, as I said, have not yet seen this Israeli advance into Gaza. It could be because of warnings from the United States that there is insufficient stocks of ammunition to support a long siege of Gaza. But in the meantime, the Israelis have been launching bombing attacks on Gaza. There's been many pictures now of civilians being killed, of residential buildings in Gaza being destroyed. This, of course, comes after lots of pictures of civilians in Israel having been killed by Hamas fighters. I mean, this is all incredibly grim. But what is much grimmer are suggestions that the Israelis are now looking to destroy Gaza entirely. There's a comment, possibly by Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, that the Israelis are thinking of turning Gaza into a city of tents, which would be an appalling thing if it were true. And there's lots of talk that the Israelis and the US are trying to persuade the Egyptian government to open the crossing points from Gaza into Egypt to allow a mass exodus of the civilian population from Gaza into Egypt. And the Egyptian authorities appear to be resisting this, exactly as I predicted that they would do a couple of days ago. And interestingly enough, and surely not by coincidence, we now have a report circulating that about 10 or more years ago, in fact, more than 10 years ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu had a conversation with the then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, and apparently, or supposedly, Netanyahu proposed to President Mubarak that the entire population of Gaza leave Gaza and relocate to Egyptian-controlled Sinai. And President Mubarak, on behalf of Egypt, rejected that proposal outright, unsurprisingly. Now, I'm not sure why Prime Minister Netanyahu might think that the Egyptians would agree to that idea, but it seems, if this conversation ever took place, that the idea was that the people of Gaza leave their city and never return, and that Gaza, which, by the way, was part of the biblical land of Canaan, it was for a time a Philistine city, that Gaza be fully absorbed into Israel and presumably settled by Israelis, extinguishing the Arab presence in Gaza entirely. Now, as I said, I want to stress I'm not absolutely sure that this conversation took place, and it could be the case also that this conversation is not being reported accurately. But these versions of the conversation between Netanyahu and Mubarak appear to be originating from Egyptian sources. And what the Egyptians appear to be saying is that if they opened the crossing points from Gaza to Gaza, and if the entire population of Gaza were indeed to leave and flee to Egypt, leaving presumably the Hamas fighters behind, so that the Israelis could deal with them? Well, there is a very high probability in that case that the Israelis would never allow those people ever to return to Gaza, and that Gaza would in that case be reabsorbed into Israel, and that Egypt, a country with many problems, many economic problems, would in that case be left with a massive number of 3.5 million Palestinian refugees on its hands, many of them angry and radicalized, many of them already indoctrinated with the ideas of Hamas, which are close to those of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is of course prescribed in Egypt. Anyway, this would create enormous problems for Egypt. So if all of this is correct, if that is what the Egyptians fear, and I want to stress, it could be that there are no such Israeli plans and that this is just the Egyptians themselves concerned about how all of this might turn out. Anyway, if these are the concerns that the Egyptians have, it is entirely understandable why they are not prepared to open the crossings, why they are not prepared to allow people from Gaza to flee to Egypt. Now, I would say, and this has to be said, that if the Israeli government does have this plan, or something like this plan, then what is proposed would be another massive infringement of human rights, war crime. It would certainly be an illegal plan, driving people from their homes, turning them into refugees, doing so intentionally, would, as I said, violate huge aspects of humanitarian and war crimes law. And again, it does strike me that people in the West who seem to be very exercised and worried about these sort of crimes and transgressions, when they're done in other places in the world, Ukraine at the moment, for example, seem to be surprisingly unconcerned by these rumours, these reports coming out of Egypt and perhaps Israel as well. But anyway, I want to stress, I'm not entirely convinced for the moment that this is indeed the Israeli plan. There was another report which I saw, which is that the Israelis and the Americans want the Egyptians to open the crossing points, not so as to enable the entire population of Gaza to flee, but simply to enable foreigners, Westerners and people of other nationalities who are currently trapped in Gaza to flee, and that might be the actual objective. But anyway, there are reports that this is the case, and I want to say again, if the Israelis do have these plans, or do have these ideas, perhaps they're ideas more than worked out plans, then this would be a terrible thing. And secondly, I cannot for the life of me imagine that the Egyptians would willingly go along with them. Which, of course, brings us back to Israel's problems, because if a military advance into Gaza might draw Israel into a prolonged and long war, fighting Hamas on its territory which is conducive to a long urban guerrilla war in which Israel would suffer extremely heavy casualties and where the outcome would be uncertain. And it seems to me that if that option is not a good one, then the alternative option of bombing Gaza in the way that is being done and doing so indefinitely really isn't any kind of military solution either. It also has massive humanitarian implications, and I have to say, I think it would be unsustainable in the long term. In the meantime, the Israelis, perhaps because they don't have easy military options, have come up with something else, which is that they've imposed a blockade of Gaza. They've cut off water and electricity and food supplies to the city. They're now saying that these will remain switched off until Hamas releases its hostages. That, it seems to me, again, is a form of collective punishment against the civilian population for the actions of an armed group in its midst. I repeat again, Hamas, which is an armed force, almost certainly has all the supplies that it needs. Taking these steps against the civilian population are going to result in a major humanitarian catastrophe. It is, again, a major violation of humanitarian and war crimes law. And I don't see that it serves Israel's interests to be seen doing this. But beyond that, the humanitarian catastrophe that this might cause, if an entire population of 3.5 million people is left without food or power or water, is unimaginable. And again, I do wonder whether this is sustainable politically and whether the Israelis have fully thought through what they're doing. Now, I come back to the point I've made in my previous videos. The Israelis need to think very carefully about what they should do. First things that they should do is to obviously sort out their intelligence systems, make sure that Israeli settlements and towns are secure, take steps like that, and perhaps negotiate through the good offices of various countries and agencies the release of the hostages, perhaps whilst at the same time agreeing to some kind of ceasefire, which many countries now around the world are proposing. Now, that might seem a weak response to some people, but it seems to me that in this difficult situation, it is the correct one, and it opens time and space for Israel to start working out a long-term solution, a long-term security solution about what it needs to do. Now, that might also, that might involve security measures. It might involve military measures. Israel is already trying to target Hamas leaders. It might involve trying to choke off supplies to Hamas of weapons and things of that kind. But it might also, in time, lead to addressing political issues as well, which of course is probably in Israel's interests. And it might also, incidentally, involve taking steps of legal redress, using international legal institutions to not just condemn, but to identify Hamas leaders and planners behind these things, the better to isolate and identify them and track them down and take action against them. It's a measured response, a calculated response, one not driven by emotion, but one which, over time, I suspect, given the revulsion that there has been against Hamas, not just in Israel and in the West, but as I've seen, even in parts of the Middle East, might actually put Israel in a stronger position than the one it is in at the moment. But I have to say that I think it is most unlikely that Israeli leaders are going to follow this advice or this course. I think that bombing of Gaza is going to continue. This food and energy and water blockade is also going to continue. And I suspect that despite all the ammunition issues, some kind of incursion into Gaza will happen as well, even though that will hugely complicate the problems, the logistical problems faced by the United States. Anyway, there we are. That's, I think, the situation at the moment on the front lines. On the front lines, this time in the Middle East. We are in a pause in terms of ground action. We're not in a pause in terms of actions by the Israeli Air Force and missile and rocket strikes. We could very well be, it must be said, in the moment of relative quiet before the storm, or we could be that we're going to be faced with a long, drawn-out situation in which Israel explores things that it can do of a dramatic nature, like blockades and bomb strikes and raids into Gaza, none of which, however, in my opinion, will improve Israel's position, and all of which will intensify the downward spiral in the Middle East. Anyway, all of this is taking place against a background of intense diplomatic activity. And I've already mentioned the fact that Secretary of State Blinken is now traveling to Israel. After he leaves Israel, he's going to go to Jordan, the one Arab country, which he apparently intends to visit, which I find remarkable and most extraordinary. And the reason he's going to Jordan is because the United States has apparently arranged with the Jordanian government for the 101st Airborne Division, the US 101st Airborne Division, to be deployed to that country. Though what exactly it is supposed to do in Jordan, other than infuriate the local people, with half the population of Jordan, more than half the population of Jordan being, by the way, Palestinians, what it is supposed to do in Jordan, I am completely unable to see. But anyway, that is what Blinken apparently is going to do. As for President Biden, well, he's had various conversations now, 3, I believe, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's also spoken to the leaders of some of the European NATO states. He's had discussions with them. But again, to my astonishment, he's only spoken so far with the leader of one Arab nation, that is the president of the current president of the United Arab Emirates. He's had a telephone conversation. The American readout of that conversation is, as always, incredibly uninformative. But there it is. That is all we have at the moment a American discussion with the President of the United Arab Emirates. There's been no attempt so far by President Biden, as far as I can see, to communicate with any of the leading leaders of the Arab states, which I do find extraordinary. In the meantime, however, diplomacy involving the Arab states is incredibly busy. And we start with the single most important conversation which has taken place. And it is a conversation between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who's also the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and President Ebrahim Raisi of Iran. Now, a year ago, a conversation between Raisi and MBS would have been inconceivable. The two countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, were on extremely bad terms with each other, to put it mildly. They considered each other to be enemies. No longer, it seems. In fact, a couple of days ago, their foreign ministers, the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers, had a telephone call to try to resolve, and apparently they successfully resolved, some mysterious incident as far as I'm concerned, involving some kind of event involving a football match or something of that kind, which I haven't really understood. But anyway, there has now been this telephone call between Raisi, President Raisi of Iran, and MBS. Now, contrary to what some reports are suggesting, including a report in the Financial Times, it is clear from the Saudi readout that it was the Iranians who initiated this discussion. But the point is that MBS agreed to take Raisi's call, and the Saudis have published a readout, and it reads, His Royal Highness Crown Prince receives phone call from Iranian president. So, as I said, that makes it clear that it was the Iranian president who telephoned MBS, not the other way around. And then the readout says that, puts it like this, His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, Crown Prince and Prime Minister, received a telephone call on Wednesday from the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. During the call, they discussed the ongoing military escalation in Gaza. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince emphasized that the kingdom is exerting maximum effort to engage with all international and regional parties to halt the ongoing escalation, and he asserted the kingdom's opposition to any form of civilian targeting and the loss of innocent lives. So that's a criticism of Hamas, but it is, of course, also a criticism of the current actions of Israel, the blockade and the bombing. And then the readout continues. He, that is to say MBS, stressed the necessity of adhering to the principles of international humanitarian law. And again, I've discussed this. The blockade violates international humanitarian law. So arguably does the bombing, though here there is more scope for ambiguity, and a mass expulsion of the population would do so in the most egregious way. And the readout goes on to say, and he expressed deep concern for the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and its impact on civilians. So you can see that the Saudis are now expressing concerns about the situation specifically in Gaza. And then the readout continues. His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, also underscored the kingdom's unwavering stance in standing up for the Palestinian cause and supporting efforts aimed at achieving comprehensive and fair peace that ensures the Palestinian people's legitimate rights. So this call between the President of Iran and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia have elicited from the Saudis this clear, unequivocal statement of support for the cause of the Palestinians. Now, it is widely overlooked in the West that the King of Saudi Arabia, who is, of course, the father of MBS, he's King Salman, in Saudi Arabia itself, he is more often referred to by his other title, the custodian of the two holy mosques. The holy mosques in question are those in the two most important religious centres of Islam, which are, of course, Mecca and Medina. But, of course, the fact that the Saudi king mostly uses that title underscores the extent to which the Saudi king and the Saudi kingdom stands at the centre of Islam and has, in its own self-conception, an overriding obligation to stand up for Islam. And what we've seen over the last few weeks have been a series of events connected with the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, which we have discussed on the Duran with Alistair Crook in a video, which, by the way, you can now see. It's been published, and in which Alistair Crook has discussed the actions that have been taken by some people in Israel, ultimately challenging the presence of the Muslim centres on the Haram al-Sharif, on the Temple Mount. And it seems to me that for the Saudis, this is an absolutely existential issue. Not only would it constitute a direct attack on their own identity and their own conception of themselves, but if there is this kind of attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the Dome of the Rock, on the Haram al-Sharif, the third most holy place in Islam, the Saudi king is custodian of the two mosques, has responsibility for two of the holy places, but this is the third. Well, if this happens, I cannot see how the Saudi king cannot but be deeply engaged in it, can't be implacably opposed to it, if he is to preserve the position that he has. And I think this is universally understood within Saudi Arabia. It is, I'm sure, understood by MBS himself. And I have to say that given that all of these events have been taking place, it explains, to my mind, why those discussions between the Saudis and the Americans about Saudi Arabia establishing diplomatic relations with Israel weren't actually going anywhere, weren't progressing well. And I don't want just to suggest here that this is a question of self-interest on the part of the Saudis. I suspect, in fact, I am sure, that MBS, the king, his father, this goes to the core of their own religious beliefs and is something which they can't possibly ignore. Anyway, here we see the outcome of all of this. The Crown Prince, MBS, on behalf of Saudi Arabia, talking on behalf of the kingdom, he reiterates that the kingdom's unwavering stance in standing up for the Palestinian cause and supporting efforts aimed at achieving comprehensive and fair peace that ensures the Palestinian people's legitimate rights. I think it is as clear a statement as it is possible to get, and I think it is one that the Saudis mean completely seriously. Now, this is the single most important conversation that has taken place over the course of this crisis. It must be one which in Israel must have been noted with some dismay, because here we see Saudi Arabia, the country that the Israelis were perhaps hoping to win over, instead having a conversation like this. It's the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia having a conversation with the president of Iran, the country which Israel has come to conceive of as its greatest enemy. But that is the way in which this whole thing currently is playing out. And it's not just a case, I should say, of the Saudis and the Iranians talking to each other, though that is in fact, up to this point, the single most important discussion that has taken place. But we see that even as the United States remains relatively quiescent, other countries, diplomatically speaking, remain extremely active. And one of the most active has been Iran. So the Iranian Foreign Minister, Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, has been extremely busy. He's been working the telephones very hard. So on the 6th of October, on the 9th of October, he spoke to the Foreign Minister of Hungary. On the 9th of October, he also called the Foreign Minister of Iraq. On the 9th of October, he also spoke to the Foreign Minister of the Taliban in Afghanistan. On the 10th of October, this is all the Foreign Minister of Iran, he called the Foreign Minister of Oman. On the 10th of October, he then again called the Foreign Minister of Qatar. And on the 10th of October, he called Josep Borrell. He had a telephone call with Josep Borrell. He then had conversations with the Secretary General of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. This was also on the 10th of October. On the 11th of October, he had a critically important conversation, we'll come to this in a moment, with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. On the 11th of October, this is all the Iranian Foreign Minister, he spoke to the Foreign Minister of Kuwait. On the 11th of October, he spoke to the Foreign Minister of Egypt. On the 11th of October, he spoke to the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. On the 11th of October, he spoke with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres. You can see how busy the Iranian foreign minister has been, even as he's probably arranged this telephone call between his President Raisi, and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS. And the Russians have also been very busy. Lavrov has also been busy working the phones, though not, of course, to quite the same degree. So on the 7th of October, Lavrov spoke to Sameh Shoukry, the Foreign Minister of Egypt. On the 9th of October, Lavrov met with the Secretary General of the Arab League, Ahmed Abul-Gheit, and this happened in Moscow. And by the way, they had a most interesting press conference. On the 9th of October, even as he was meeting in Moscow with the Secretary General of the Arab League, Lavrov spoke with the Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates. On the 10th of October, Lavrov met with the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Iraq, who of course was in Moscow in the company of the Prime Minister, the Iraqi Prime Minister, who was simultaneously holding talks with President Putin. On the 10th of October, well, Lavrov had that telephone call, which I've already mentioned, with the Foreign Minister of Iran, Hossein Amir Abdullahian. And, of course, Lavrov continues to be very active. Contrast all this intense diplomatic activity by the Saudis, by the Iranians, by the Russians, with, as I said, the sluggishness of the Americans. Blinken goes to Israel, inevitably. He's going to Jordan. Biden has only spoken to Netanyahu, apart from one call to the president of the UAE. One also sees here dividing lines starting to appear. The Russians, the Saudis, the Iranians, the other Arab states, they're all talking about the rights of the Palestinians, about the Palestinian issue. The Americans remain overridingly focused on Israel and its security concerns. Now, I've spoken about Lavrov's call with the Abdullahian, Amir Abdullahian, the Iranian foreign minister. The Iranians have, by the way, produced a readout of this call, which once is more interesting than the Russian. It says that the two foreign ministers discussed topical issues on the Middle East agenda with a focus on the new round of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They stressed the importance of efforts to put an end to the armed confrontation without delay and to settle the situation based on well-known international legal documents. And that is a call for a ceasefire. That's an Iranian readout. It is not a call from Iran for an escalation. And we see some of this being mirrored by the Russians. And I mentioned that Lavrov had held a press conference with the Secretary General of the Arab League, who visited Moscow, and over the course of that press conference, Lavrov was asked this question. Today, there are many initiatives on how to deal with the surge of tensions in the Middle East. What are Russia's plans? Is Russia ready to cooperate if the Israeli authorities ask Moscow for help in mediating the liberation of hostages or identifying the whereabouts of missing persons? And Lavrov replied as follows. Did you say that there are many initiatives on how to deal with the surge of tensions in the Middle East? I know nothing about them. There are appeals for an immediate end to the bloodshed and the commencement of talks, but there can be only one initiative on implementing the UN resolutions concerning the solution to the Palestine problem. This implies coexistence of two states, Israel and Palestine, living in peace, security, and good neighborliness. That is what we talked about earlier today. He means with the Secretary General of the Arab League. Our shared position is that this is the only initiative that can be on the table and should be the subject of direct talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis. As for mediating efforts, the parties themselves should stop the hostilities, whilst the rest can be addressed in a normal, non-military forum. So that was said by Lavrov. His boss, President Putin, has been saying a great deal more. Now, Putin has been attending the session of Russian Energy Week. He has been scathing over the course of a press conference that he gave about European energy policy. He said that the Europeans have got this disastrously wrong. I'm going to discuss that in a program, a dedicated program, which we're going to do on the Duran with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. It would take too much time to cover this in this program. But anyway, Putin had this to say when he was directly asked the question over a course of a press conference. Who bears responsibility for the ongoing fighting that has lasted 75 years? And Putin says this. Yesterday, my colleague, he means the Prime Minister of Iraq, and I discussed this issue. It is simply impossible not to. Iraq is a country in the Middle East, and the Palestinian problem touches the heart of every person in this region, and I think every Muslim's heart. See that the Arabs understand the religious dimension to this conflict, even if in the West there is a struggle to do this. This is where life has led. There are obvious things, and people view all this, not only what is taking place, but what has occurred for decades, as a manifestation of the injustice that has ramped up dramatically. Why? Because initially, when a decision was adopted on creating the State of Israel, a parallel decision was made on creating a second state. So initially, it was about establishing two independent sovereign states, Israel and Palestine. As we know, Israel was established, while Palestine as an independent sovereign state was never created. It did not happen for a variety of reasons. I will not go into details now. What Putin is referring to is a resolution by the UN General Assembly in 1947 to divide, partition the territory of the British Mandate of Palestine into two states, Israel and Palestine. I should say, quickly and in parenthesis, that the partition plan was at that time accepted by the Israelis but rejected by the Arabs. There's an awful lot more that could be said about this. This is a vast topic, I just wanted to get that out of the way, however, because I'm sure somebody will bring it up. But the point Putin is making, that even in 1947, right at the outset of this, it was always understood that there had to be two states, Israel and Palestine, sharing the land. And Putin again goes on to say, furthermore, part of the land that his Palestinians have always considered as originally belonging to them has been occupied by Israel at different times and in different ways, but for the most part, obviously through military force. But what is the current problem? Resolution mechanisms exist, but the United States has neglected them over the past few years, choosing to regulate everything on its own. It did not use these mechanisms, instead relying on its own efforts to meet the material needs of those living in the Palestinian territories. The United States basically tried to replace solutions to fundamental political issues with handouts of one kind or another. Obviously, this is very important for people with a low standard of living, important to address socio-economic issues, but we have always argued that this will never be enough. You cannot solve the problem in its entirety without addressing fundamental political issues, the main one being the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. However, this is exactly the bet that was made. Also, the settlement policy and certain other aspects have ultimately led to this explosion of violence. Certain other aspects? Is he referring here to the events in the Haram al-Sharif, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the Temple Mount? Almost certainly. But he's being, again, careful in his use of words. But anyway, he continues to say, what is happening now is horrible. We understand that the bitterness is immense on both sides, but regardless of its level, every effort should be made to minimize or reduce to zero the losses among civilians, among women, children, and elderly. If the men choose to fight, let them fight amongst themselves, but leave children and women alone. This applies to both sides. In other words, it's not just Hamas, it's Israel also. We do not know whether the situation will calm down anytime soon, but every effort must be made to this end, because expansion of the conflict could have drastic effects, including for the energy sector. And then further on, he went on to make further comments. He said, I would add that the position of Russia, which I have just outlined, did not develop today, and not just in connection with these tragic events. It has developed over decades, and this position is well known to the Israeli side and to our friends in Palestine. We have always advocated the implementation of decisions of the UN Security Council, bearing in mind, first of all, the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. This is the root of all problems. And naturally, everything that has accompanied this problem in recent years has aggravated it. Settlement activity. This does not mean that Israel's position is that it is necessary to do as they do. The position of the United States is what I said, to resolve only issues of a material nature, and Russia's position is another, to create an independent state. In fact, the position is more complicated. In the states which are involved, there are many politicians and experts who believe that we need to listen and follow the path of creating an independent Palestinian state, and there are such people in Israel. But those who have been trying to solve this problem by force 4 decades are gaining the upper hand, which unfortunately leads to the tragic incidents that we are seeing now. Now, I am going to make a prediction. Don't often do that, but I am now. I think that there is now a diplomatic head of steam starting to build up. We see the Iranians talking to the Saudis. We see the Russians talking to the Iranians. There have also been Russian-Saudi contacts. The Saudis were present at the energy forum in Moscow. The Saudi energy minister has given a long interview on Russian television in which he has said that the Saudis, by the way, intend to continue with their production cuts in order to stabilize the oil market and might be ready to take further action. That was said by the Saudi energy minister, oil minister on Russian television. But anyway, I suspect that what we're going to see over the next few weeks is a convergence of all of these various strands, and there's going to be a major push by the Egyptians, the Iranians, the Russians, the Saudis, and also the Chinese. And there have been some very interesting commentaries in the Chinese media. The Chinese government has been extremely silent about what has been going on. They've been avoiding making many public statements about this, but the statements of the Chinese media are fully in line with these comments of Putin's and Lavrov's and MBS's and of the Iranians. There's going to be a major head of steam over the next few days, weeks, for a ceasefire, demands for a ceasefire, and then for a diplomatic initiative, for a wider diplomatic push to try to broker some kind of sustainable settlement of the conflict involving ultimately the creation of a Palestinian state. Now notice that all of these countries that I've been talking about today, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all of these countries that are engaged in all of these diplomatic contacts, they are now members of the BRICS. And I personally would not be surprised if at some point over the next few days we have an emergency meeting of the BRICS, and if the BRICS propose a joint initiative. And I would also not be surprised if this initiative were presented to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, if Turkey, with whose President Erdogan, the Russians have now spoken, also joins in, and if the Security Council, if discussion there is blocked, if this results in an attempt to convene an urgent meeting of the UN General Assembly, and something possibly develops out of that. Now, as I said, I'm not saying that these moves at the UN or by the BRICS are necessarily what is in play, but all the straws in the wind point to some kind of big diplomatic effort being prepared to wrest control of the diplomatic process, the mediating process in the Middle East, away from the Americans. The Americans, for their part, apparently don't see it. They're, as I said, taking all the usual reflexive actions, but they don't seem to be offering any new or constructive ideas, and they're not talking to the people who matter. Well, this is where I'm going to finish this program, the part of this program that is going to be involve the situation in the Middle East. I'm now going to discuss the situation in Ukraine. I'm going to give it a lot less time than I have previously, but there are some very important events going on the battlefronts. And it seems that there was a major Russian assault over the last 2 days in the Avdiivka area. And reports have been pouring in this morning that the Russians have captured a terrain feature known as the slag heap, which is located near the Avdiivka coke plant, which is the biggest industrial structure facility in close to Avdiivka. This is a coal mining region. The Donbass is first and foremost a coal mining region. And this slag heap, as I say, it's a terrain feature, is the product of that coke plant and of the coal mining that has been taking place in this area. And I've seen film of this slag heap. And by the way, I've been hearing things about it all the way back to the early reports of the fighting, going all the way back to March of last year, that the slag heap is an essential terrain feature to capture in order to dominate the area around Avdiivka. Capture of the slag heap gives one control of the high ground. Now, these photos of this thing that I have seen, it's a man-made structure. It's the product of industrial pollution, some would say, air flux. Anyway, whatever. There are pictures of it, and it is enormous. It looms over the landscape. In this case, we absolutely are justified in talking about high ground. And of course, it has been a central part of the Ukrainian defense system for Avdiivka. If the reports are correct, and it seems that they are, and that the Russians have not only captured it, but have consolidated control of it, then they dominate. They dominate the landscape. They can observe close up whatever is going on. They don't have to just send drones. They can see things through their binoculars and whatever. And of course, the other thing is if they can drag artillery pieces up, they're in perfect position to shell Ukrainian positions across this landscape. And it would put the Russians in a powerful position of advantage. Now, the Russians have also been spreading lots of reports today that capture of the slag heap does not in and of itself mean that the Battle of Avdiivka is ended. Patrick Lawrence, that intrepid Canadian reporter who has reported extensively from this area, he says that the area of Avdiivka is one of the most heavily fortified parts of the front line. Ukraine has been building its fortifications in Avdiivka for 8 years, and this is why it has proved so difficult for the Russians to capture this town. And most Russian commentators expect this battle for Avdiivka to last for weeks and perhaps months, deep into the winter. And the general conclusion seems to be that even with the slag heap now under Russian control, it would be impossible, it would make no sense for the Russians to launch a frontal assault on Avdiivka. The losses which would be involved would be enormous. Apparently, the Russians took some losses in trying to capture the slag heap itself, which, given, as I said, what a tall structure it is, doesn't surprise me in any event. But anyway, this is going to be a long battle. But with the capture of the slag heap, Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka are starting to become or look untenable. The Russians are now astride some of the roads into Avdiivka. There was film yesterday of the Russians destroying what looked like a moving train that was being sent by the Ukrainians with supplies into Avdiivka, perhaps ammunition. So, as I said, this is now looking to be an increasingly difficult, even desperate battle for the Ukrainians, and a major event in terms of the overall progress in the war. Now, I said that the Russians most probably are planning a gradual incremental offensive this autumn and winter, and there's evidence of this now in every part of the front lines. The Ukrainian offensive, even though this has not been openly stated by Ukraine or in the West, they're now on the defensive pretty much everywhere, and the Russians are increasing the pressure all the time. And this capture of this important feature in Avdiivka is perhaps the first sign of that. And it might be the case, an indicator that this is the case has been perhaps provided by a rather strange interview that the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, has given to Ukrainska Pravda, and he has said that the Ukrainian armed forces are out of schedule. It wasn't clear what he meant by that. He said that it would be untrue to say that everything has gone wrong, which again is an odd formulation. But anyway, suffice to say that Budanov does seem to be increasingly less confident, or perhaps even straightforwardly depressed and pessimistic about the overall situation. And of course, ammunition shortages, I've already discussed them at the start of the program, and how they might be having an effect on Israeli attempts to advance into Gaza. General global American ammunition shortage, but all the indications are that this is intensifying, and this is starting to affect Ukraine's conduct of operations in this war. So that's where we are with the situation in Ukraine. I suspect that at some point over the next few days, I'll be starting to talk about Ukraine more extensively than I have recently. But as I said, the world does not stop. Things happen. The United States, the Western powers, wanted to focus all attention on Ukraine. What we see is that the world is unpredictable, and instead we've now had this explosion in the Middle East. And that is having an effect on the progress of the war in Ukraine, with problems of ammunition, and it could very well have what has happened in Ukraine might be having an effect on what is happening in the Middle East, if it has indeed slowed a potential Israeli attack on Gaza. Well, there we are. That is my program for today. Shorter than yesterday. We will see how things evolve. But as I said, diplomatic activity is intense, not conducted to any real extent, as far as I can tell, by the United States. As I said, if there's an emergency meeting of BRICS foreign ministers, if some kind of BRICS plan is proposed at some point over the next few days, if the BRICS decide to take it to the Security Council or to the General Assembly, something which I suspect the Americans will not be happy about at all, well, I, for one, would not be surprised. And I think, personally, it is plausible and even likely. Well, thank you for joining me again. More from me soon. Just to reiterate, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, the former Twitter. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please remember also to check out our shop. Go to the amazing things that you will find there on mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And as I said, we will see what comes next.